gather in. Hopefully some more will be on their way, but it is time to begin. I'd like to welcome our good friend Peggy Gish back with us again. As you know, she has done remarkable peacemaking around the world, most recently in Iraq and Nigeria. And this is a gathering of our new model of Peace Forum. And we hope to be here until about 5:45 or so. And then after our time together, some of us will be going over to Thyatira restaurant for a meal together. Anyone who would like to come is welcome. Peggy brought some of her books and some of her late husband's books, Art Gish's books. So take a look at those, and I'm just going to turn it over to Peggy and do what you like.
Okay. Right back here. Maybe I'm moving it up a little bit. There we go. Yeah. Well, today is more of a peace forum, and Scott said, why don't you just start sharing about peacemaking here as well as abroad. So I thought I'd start a little bit with my journey into peacemaking and then move abroad from there. And then tomorrow in the chapel I'll be focusing on Nigeria. So today isn't specifically about that, but feel free to talk about Nigeria if that's what you want. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you again. And I was thinking about my peace journey. And I guess where I have to start is just from my roots in the Church of the Brethren, from a Brethren family, a pacifist family, and then the roots in the Bible, roots in the New Testament. I guess as I thought about it, I just happened to believe what I was told in Sunday school. Things, radical things like love your enemies, like not laying up for yourselves treasures on earth, about love being more powerful than hate and violence. You know, all these things that we are told later on in our life that's not very practical, and you can kind of slip that aside. But I took those things seriously, and so as I was a young teen growing up in Chicago, when 2 doors down from our house, somebody threw a brick into the window of the first African-American family that moved in our neighborhood. I knew that was wrong. And later on, when I was in college, and it was in 1963, so that dates me a lot, and the Civil Rights Movement was starting. And we were at Manchester College, and we heard that there was going to be a bus to this big gathering in Washington, D.C. And so we were on the bus, and we're there at the big March on Washington in '63, which really influenced me a lot. And I began to see how my white privilege made me more insensitive to the needs of my brothers and sisters around me that didn't have that privilege. And how I wanted to be on the side of justice, working to reach out and walk with people who are dealing with injustice every day, but need allies, need people walking through them, with them, and speaking the truth to the power structures. And so my interest and my actions went on from there. It went on into the time of the Vietnam War, being in Chicago again, and being out on the street to say that there should not be a war in Vietnam, and that we should resist that, and we should not cooperate with that. And so my activism was not a quiet activism, a passive one of just believing these things, but I believe that we need to be a witness to what we believe publicly, and to stand up and speak out. And so because these things are being done in our name, If we're silent, then it looks like we're consenting to these things. And if we are compelled to witness to our faith, and we're also compelled to witness to the peace aspect of our faith, the holistic faith, the peace and justice aspect of Jesus' life and Jesus' teachings. Well, the other part of that is to point to alternatives. What then should we be doing? And so it's not a matter of just protesting, but how should we then live? So in our life here, Art and I, we asked ourselves the question, how do we live in a way that, there's no way that's pure, no way that we are not collaborating or at least benefiting from the structures of violence, okay? But how can we live in a way that least supports violence and contributes to violence? And so we decided to move in with others in a Christian community, an attempt that wasn't greatly successful, but for many years we lived together, had hospitality with people in need around us, and we lived very simply because we believed that we should not use a lot more of our world's resources and than we should. In fact, even then we were using more than most of the people in the world. And then we began to move outward. Well, during that time we were doing local peacemaking work, involved in protesting wars, protesting capital punishment, violence against women, and other forms of violence. And then we were given a vision of going abroad. Not that we could change all that's happening, but we could be a light and be a witness. And so both Art and I got involved in the Christian peacemaker teams. First of all, in Palestine. Both of us worked in Palestine. And then I branched out from there and began to work in Iraq. And so from 2002 to a year ago, I was in northern Iraq. What we saw is that as we began to work in these places, we were living among people who were the victims of oppression, victims of violence, victims of war. And as I went to Iraq, particularly in October of 2002, 5 months before the war started, and then stayed there on into the war, I began to feel very keenly the suffering of people who are facing violence, and felt very strongly that God wants people of goodwill, Christians, others of goodwill, to be with people who are facing violence, walk with them, let them know that others care, do what we can to be helpful. And so the love was given to me for the people of Iraq that allowed me to walk ahead in spite of my fear. And then I learned that, yes, indeed, love does help you conquer your fear. So all through this time, through my experience, I'm learning that these things that I learned in Sunday school back then are true. These things in the Bible, first it was just in my head, and now it's real. I'm really dealing with fear and struggling with that. But the love given to me is what compels me to do this work, as well as what enables me to do this work, gives me the strength. So, in our work, what can we do in this? Well, there's many things. We weren't able to stop the war. We weren't able to turn it around. We weren't able to change U.S. policy, all these big things. But we were able to walk with people within that situation and witness against war, witness against violence. And so some of our work, like I said, was accompaniment work, where sometimes we couldn't do much more than just let people know that we cared about them. And write their stories, share their stories with people back home to put a face on the people of Iraq or the people of Palestine or the people of Nigeria, so that people can see them as real people that are hurting. Sometimes accompaniment meant walking with people out of situations of danger. And there were times in Palestine where we would walk with people or be with people to protect them from soldiers or settlers. Excuse me, my sinus problems here. In Iraq, sometimes it meant just going with people to get information about their loved ones who had been imprisoned and to help them find them or advocate for them. We went with Palestinian Iraqis to the border when they wanted to leave in the midst of danger, when they were being targeted and men were being pulled out of their homes and being killed. So they begged us to go with them to the border to be refugees. So wherever we could, we found ourselves accompanied. And then this led us to tell the truth about the situation. And as I think about Jesus' ministry, there's many incidences which he spoke clearly to the leaders of the day about their corruption, about what they were doing, spoke out against injustice. And that's the same work that we do, telling the truth. And that doesn't mean we have the total truth about everything. It's not that kind of thing. But it means when we are there witnessing what is really happening, we're compelled to share that, to tell what's really going on. And being in Iraq, I found there were a lot of times when the information was not coming back here. You got a very mixed message, you got a very skewed message. You didn't, we did a report on the prisoners being tortured, months before it came out in the press here. And people didn't believe us, they thought we were making this up, whatever. We're telling the truth about what war is really like, what anti-terrorism is really like, which, by the way, anti-terrorism, when I think of the city of Fallujah being bombed over a period of time and 60% of the houses being totally destroyed, that was to get rid of that terrorist group there. So we destroyed this whole city and masses of people being gassed and being napalmed and all of these horrible things that happened there. That's what anti-terrorism is like in Iraq, is massive violence, excessive violence, and it actually has the reverse effect of actually propagating violence and actually increasing it. So just trying to tell the truth. Telling the truth about war, that it did not solve the problems. It did not make things safer or better for people, just the rhetoric was being told. So these are the kinds of things we felt compelled to do. At times, we find ourselves interrupting violence or confronting. More often in Palestine than in Iraq. It was harder to actually interrupt things there, but there were times in Palestine where we would be walking along and a soldier would be beating a Palestinian, and we would walk up to that soldier and we'd say, treat that person with respect. Of course, we would try to say it respectfully to him. And that would more than often stop that soldier from beating. Not always, but often that was the case, so we could actually intervene. And having an international person there watching, or just standing there watching them, sometimes would make them stop because they didn't want to be watched. So there were times we could do that. Well, the other thing was witnessing to the power of love. And I want to tell this story of, this was in, I'll start with the earlier story. In January of 2005, at the end of a 5-day nonviolence training that we did in the city of Karbala, a Shia Muslim holy city, we did a training with about 26 Shia Muslims who wanted to form their own peace group. And at the end of that time, they were brainstorming, what are we going to do with this? And they said, we want to call ourselves the Muslim Peacemaker Team. Your Christian Peacemaker Team. We'll work together. And we did work together over the next number of years. So they brainstormed and they came up with some really good suggestions. let's teach children peacemaking. Start with the children and try to reverse a lot of the patterns of our society. Let's teach prison guards and soldiers. Let's do this. You know, they came up with a lot of good ideas. And then somebody dropped, not a literal bombshell, but a figurative bombshell, and said, let's go into Fallujah and let's try to help them rebuild. So this was, 3 months after the November 2004 bombings of Fallujah. And then you could hear a pin drop. Everybody was silent. And then suddenly, it was chaos. But what if they don't accept us in their community? What if they kill us? See, these are Shia, and in Fallujah is mostly Sunni. Not all, total, but almost all. And so these were realistic fears. And then one other man said, this is what peacemaking is all about. To take risks, to go into areas of our society and work for reconciliation. And so a month later, we found ourselves in 3 cars going into Fallujah with the Muslim peacemaker team, CBT. And as we got in, we saw the destruction, just shocking destruction. As I said, 60% totally destroyed. And we went to the hospital that had been bombed to give some medical supplies that the persons had collected. We went to mosques, we saw schools bombed. We went to the southern part of the city where it was almost complete rubble, and people were living in tents. And we were taking pictures because at that time, hardly any international persons had gotten into Fallujah. We were told we had a 5%? No, getting in. And yet we got in. The doors were open. But we were taking pictures to show people what it looked like. And a woman came out of the tent and invited us to come in. And so we did. And we went in and sat around on the floor of the tent with the extended family. About 26 people were living in this tent at night. And they had a little gas canister in the corner where they cooked all of their food. They served us tea with hospitality. And then began to tell their story of how a few days before the attacks, they and about 300,000 people from the city left the city. It was a city of 400,000 people. And then they stayed in a school room where a room would be divided up by blankets between families and all crowded in there together. And then a month before we met them, they were forced to come back into the city of Fallujah, even though their house had been bombed and they had no place to live. And then a few days later, they were given a tent to stay in. Well, in the course of that hour that we were with them, we felt very drawn together. And as we were getting ready to leave, the women hugged and kissed each other on the cheek, like Iraqi style, and men did the same. And we just felt the tears were coming down our face. We just felt very drawn together. And the reason I share this is, that's not uncommon to feel close to people. But here we were. Many of us were Americans who we could have been seen as their enemy. We were from the country that had bombed their city and bombed their home, destroyed. And then there were the Shia Muslims here that were also could have been seen as enemies. And yet the power of love and just being open to each other as human beings, refusing to see ourselves as enemies, we were brought close together. And over in my time there, I felt the power of love to break down the barriers of hostility. And for me, that was, some of the most precious times in my experiences there to really experience that power and to know the power of love. It didn't change the whole situation, but it can break down the barriers of hostility. And we refuse to see people as our enemies too, as we went. And so one time when we were invited to go to the village of Abu Hishma, which had been surrounded by razor wire by the U.S. military, and a stiff curfew was put on it. And some of the people there, and that was because along the road outside of the village, somebody attacked a military unit. It wasn't even in the village. And so they accused somebody in the village, and they punished the whole village. And they also arrested a lot of the men. They were taken to Abu Ghraib. Well, when we were invited to go there, we first decided, well, let's go and visit the U.S. military base right nearby. Now, this was the same base that had the man killed along the road. It had, the same unit. So as we talked to them, we said, we're planning to go to Abu Hishma. And the commander said, don't go there. These are terrorists. They will kill you. And that's the kind of language we heard all the time from the U.S. military. And we were kind of getting used to that. And we had spoke to people before that were supposed to be dangerous and found them just to be human beings like us. But it took us aback a little bit, and we rethought that. We even had a time of prayer together. And we decided, yes, we're going to go anyway. And so we went to Abu Hishma. We were well received. We felt very safe there. We ended up staying the night. The next day, walked around and talked with the people that are supposed to be these terrorists, and heard the stories of how, and saw places where, from helicopters, buildings were bombed, and most of the men were taken off to prison. As, again, anti-terrorism is this overreaction. But when we refuse to look at people as our enemies, we usually find friends where we go. Now, that doesn't mean we don't take precautions, and that doesn't mean we're stupid about where we go. But we find people to just be hurting people that are victims of that, people that do get angry, but people that need love and care. The last time I was in Iraq was a year ago, when people were flooding we had moved up into the Kurdish area, and people were flooding in who were the victims of ISIS. And so these were families who had members killed right in front of their eyes, or their women taken away to be sex slaves. And so they were flooding in after walking for miles through Syria and up north and then back into Iraq. And were very traumatized. We spent a lot of time just listening to them and trying to understand what they had gone through and share their stories. And again, this was one of those situations where we couldn't change. We couldn't do very much to change their situation, but to let them know that they were important. Somebody cared about them was important. And then because of that, we were able to share the story of the truth of what was going on there. Well, I think I'm going to stop right here with my formal remarks and just close by saying that for me, it's been some of the more difficult experiences of my life, but some of the most rewarding, where I really found the scriptures come to life, the teachings of Jesus, real and true, and something that I could walk out on faith with, and knowing that something could happen to me or others, and there were people on our team that something did happen to, but knowing that God was with us, walking with us, and guiding us, and would be there with us in the midst of whatever happened. Okay. questions, or comment, or disagree with what I'm saying? Share your own story?
With the military people that you have talked to and said that these are terrorists, did you see any of them again afterward, or?
Yes, we saw the commander later, and Cliff Kindy was with us, and he tried to convince the commander to join CPT. He was on the offensive, the loving, the nonviolent offensive. I mean, trying to talk to him about what had gone on and share with him what we experienced. So we did see him, but he kept saying, well, this is just a job, I have to keep my family going, he had all kinds of reasons why this wasn't very practical. He was willing to dialogue. He wasn't hostile to us. What?
I mean, he was talking.
He was talking. Yeah. He didn't like what we were doing. And then another time, about a month later, we helped with lawyers that were working to deal with the cases of the men that were arrested there in Abu Mishma. They're the ones actually that invited us to come there. And they weren't getting anywhere with the military. They were trying to really take their role as lawyers and to represent these men that were in Abu Ghraib, but they weren't allowed to do their work. And so we arranged for a meeting between the lawyers and the commander and his and a couple others to talk about this and to try and dialogue. So,
and he was willing to do that.
He was willing to do that. And I think it was because international presence was there. Now, what happened is, after the first meeting later when we weren't there, then he wasn't cooperating with them. But when we were there, he was cooperating. Because he didn't want us to give the real picture, he didn't want us to give a bad name or bad rap to what he was about and doing. So he wanted to put on a good face, because that next meeting just kind of fell apart. He refused to cooperate when we weren't there.
Were any of those prisoners released then, or not?
No, they were not.
But you had the photographs.
Yeah, we had the photograph of the meeting. Of them sitting around with the,
It's remarkable how he did cooperate when you were there.
Yeah, right.
At least
He was real concerned about his image. Other things?
During your time there, did you ever come across any of the more aggressive people or groups, and how did you react? How did you react to those situations where you in fear of your lives? What happened?
Well, we met with groups of solders, people, but they too were not aggressive to us. And of course, what we found out was that a lot of what they were doing, maybe 90% of what they were doing, was humanitarian work. And we saw a lot of good work among them, and just local people that weren't particularly militant, even though they were also involved in violence. But we felt very safe among them. They weren't aggressive. What happened as far as aggression is when we had 4 members of our team kidnapped in November of 2005. 5. And that's where we encountered, not directly, I was there, part of the team looking for them, trying to find them, and we visited many Muslim groups who then offered to help, put out the word that our team was there to help them, not representatives of the U.S. government, and so did a lot of PR work. But that was a situation where we didn't directly then encounter the kidnappers. They actually fled before, one of our men was killed, Tom Fox. And then a month later, the other 3 were released, but the kidnappers fled before the British and U.S. soldiers arrived there. And so the 3 men were very suspicious that there was some kind of inside communications between the kidnappers and the militaries that made that possible to happen. And so, but we didn't directly deal with it. And then the other situation was when we moved up to North. Well, after the kidnapping, our people we were working with, partners in Baghdad, said, you have to leave Baghdad. You're, after the kidnapping and Khan was killed and everything, they said, you're just too high profile now, people know where you are, just targets. And then they said, but also you put your neighbors in danger, and translators, drivers, and told us very clearly, you must leave. So we moved up to northern Iraq, and so up in that area, we started traveling around. And we're told it was safe to go to a certain area in northwestern Iraq. And 2 of us went there and were kidnapped. And I was one of those. And so that was personally dealing with kidnappers. But evidently we were with a lower level, an entry level kidnapping where they were going to sell us to more brutal people. And so fortunately, many things happened that my colleague, Will, who was with me, a 29-year-old Mormon pacifist, the only Mormon in CPT, knew fluent in Arabic, better than my Arabic. And so he was talking constantly to our guard and told him about CPT and the stories of how we worked in Palestine. He started telling the story about my husband standing in front of a tank in the Hebron produce market. And then a little later, the guard went out, and when he came back, he said, tomorrow you're going to be released with your translator. So I was only there 2 days, 2 nights, and then I was released, but Will was kept for another 8 days, and then finally released. So we don't understand, but we can't help but believing it has something to do with our work and maybe also them thinking that they're not going to get very much out of us if they do pursue that. So we did it that way, but we never, I don't know, in quite the way you're asking where we were. There were people that didn't want to work with us, but most of the people that didn't want to work with us were secular people or very more extremist Muslims. But the first time we went into Fallujah in June of 2003, that's before this attack and everything I've talked about, when we just simply went there and we actually considered moving there, working there, and we sat around this room talking with about 20 Muslim sheikhs, and some of them were religious sheikhs, some of them were just tribal sheikhs. And we explained who we were. We had already done work with prisoners and prisoners' families, so we had a little bit of a record, and they knew that what kind of work we were doing. And they said, "You can move here, and we will, because you respect us, we will respect you." And basically, that's the attitude that we received from Muslims. It depended who we were, what we were doing, and how we treated people. They didn't like how they were being treated by the U.S. military, which is pretty demeaning, pretty ruthless. And, if they did work with them, they had to do, they were like a PI, and they had to follow everything that they were to do. So it really took away their dignity. Do you want to pursue that at all?
Huh?
Okay. Yeah. But we had to follow our leanings, and we knew that we could be in danger. And we knew that even just traveling to Fallujah at that time, either time, we were in danger. And yet we decided that the work was important to do, and we would take that risk. That's. And again, as I say, when we went there to Fallujah after the, both times, but after the attacks, we went there at the invitation of local people who then hosted us. So that was another way to offset the danger. Doesn't completely take it away, but reduces the danger, is to go with local people. Invited the local group take us around. And then we're actually fairly safe, even in Fallujah, if local people are hosting us. It makes a big difference. And we always did that. We went at people's invitation, listened to them. What do they want us to do? We didn't come with our own agenda to catch on it, but we're trying to respond to the needs and listen. What would you like from an international group like us? How can we be helpful? And sometimes it was just supporting them in their program, and they would feel more like they could work publicly. They had felt stronger because they had other international people with them at times. Sometimes that was the way. Yeah.
Were you requested by people to do public actions on their behalf or like help them?
Yeah, we were. And so we would be there among them. These were nonviolent actions. We wouldn't take part in anything, but, and some of those were with local human rights organizations dealing with the abuse of prisoners. There were a lot of public actions around that issue and vigils, and then there was even a couple public actions that Sadr had organized in Baghdad that was not violent, but it brought in other people. It wasn't just the Sadr people, the Sadrs. It was a coalition of people all over that were against the occupation and wanted the U.S. to leave. And it was very peaceful. We were welcomed. We were part of that. Another time when we were part of a caravan going into Najaf, where al-Sistani was a very strong, very powerful Shia leader, had gone in to try to be a mediator between the Sadrs who were fighting American troops in Najaf. And the Sadrs had holed up into one of the mosques there. And so Sistani was going in a caravan to try to prevent more violence and try to stop that. And we were invited to be a part of that. So we were part of the caravan, and we were with the Muslim peacemaker teams there. And at certain places we would be out among people. And then as we got into it, there was an area that they told us not to go any further because there was shooting and some violence going on, things like that. But people really appreciated our presence and support. And and a lot of times our work, we did other nonviolence trainings too. And so part of our work was just to encourage nonviolence in that situation, finding alternatives to working in there.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you about the Muslim peacemaker movement, if it's still active and what they're up to now.
Well, they were very active, more publicly active for about 3 years, and then it became more dangerous to be out, and some of their members were targeted, some of their members were killed for their work. And then they became a little more, not complete, they're still going, but they're just not as active publicly. And they're doing more education work among them, trying to convince people of nonviolence. And they go to the roots of their faith, Islam, for their nonviolence. And so some of their work has to do with religious education about peacemaking. So it's a little more of that and not as much of the public. Although in the last week there have been a lot of peaceful protests in Baghdad, and I'm still in contact on Facebook with some of the Muslim peacemaker teams. They've been sending pictures of them out on the street. They're dealing with corruption in the current government, and so I'm seeing them out on the street. So now again, they're part of that movement.
And just to follow up, are they still primarily a Shia group, or are they kind of a...
They are, but even back then, there were like at least 2 Sunnis who were members of that. They were open. It wasn't closed to just be Shia, but it was a majority. And they developed relationships with people in Fallujah. And they had an ongoing, and they did go back and forth over the years after that trip that I shared about 1 or 2 attempts. That was an ongoing relationship to work for reconciliation there. And at one point, so the people of Fallujah wanted to be a nonviolence training and wanted to do peace work, and then it just got too violent and they gave up. They said, we can't do this. It's just people are being killed. We can't. So it's really hard working there. You get crushed.
Speaking of difficult things, you've had some amazing stories about your reception when bombs are falling on people.
Yeah.
What about when you try to tell these stories to some of the leaders here in the United States, like the commander there?
Well, they think I'm naive, or they think you're crazy for being in that situation, and they don't appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. And so, like when we would, like going into that base where, the commander, he thought we were kind of crazy or something too. And sometimes when we would go on military bases with families to try to find their loved one or get information or advocate, we'd go on the base, we'd get in, and then soldiers would meet us. Oh, Americans! They'd come up and want to talk to us. I mean, we had real positive reception with the average soldier. It was the people in charge that didn't. And we did meet then with the commander. I was there, 2 of us, with a family member to try to advocate for his uncle. Anyway, and the commander was very condescending toward the man, and we're here bringing democracy and we're doing these great things. I mean, I hear all this rhetoric from them, and they were kind of condescending to us.
And what about representatives?
Oh, here, yeah.
People are making a decision to send those commanders.
Right. Well, we just don't get answers. I mean, I not actually try to go and talk to the president, but writing to my Congress people, writing to the president, whatever. Let's see, when Obama was just elected but wasn't president yet, there was a concern about the Kurds and Turkey. We were already moved up to the north. And we were visiting villages along the border, along the Turkish border, along the Iranian border, that were being bombed by either country. And we started going to the villages and meeting with the families that were being displaced. And then we quickly found out that the real issue there, where Turkey was bombing and Iran was rocketing, they weren't doing it from the sky like Turkey was, with missiles, they claimed that this was anti-terrorism, that this was against the PKK. So what we found out in our traveling extensively along that area was that where they were targeting, there were very few PKK. They were not targeting the bases up in the mountains. So we wrote a general report that we sent to our government officials here, but also to the European Union, to the UN, agencies. And we went and talked to people, and people did not want to get too involved with that. And then we went to a military base. I spoke to a man, he's a U.S. State Department representative in the North. And I explained to him what we had seen, and I gave him a copy of our report. And I shared about several people that had been maimed or killed, and that we spoke with their family. And I said, and he would say, well, we're making this area safe for these people to move back in their homes. And I said, that's not what they are saying. They don't feel safer. Their lives are more in danger. And they're not afraid of the PKK. They're afraid of maybe with a bomb, they're being destroyed. But he had, I don't know if he really heard me, because I know he had to say what he said, because he has to give the official line. And I hope he heard me as a person, I don't know, but he didn't. But again, anti-terrorism, the real issue there is the Kurdish issue. That's the issue there. Turkey is afraid that more and more of the Kurds in Turkey, will demand and will secede and become their own, that's what they're afraid of, and so that's the big issue.
Yeah, so we sort of turn a blind eye to what the Kurds are doing with our,
Yeah.
not the Kurds, but the Turks are
Right.
doing with our military aid,
Yeah.
turning against the Kurds rather than.
Right, and that's why right now, with the fight against ISIS, Turkey is bombing the Kurdish
Yes,
groups,
yes.
and using that excuse. I'm not, and I don't want to give you the impression that the Kurds are not fighting back. I mean, they're being fighting back too.
Yeah.
It's not like they're totally pure or anything like that, but anyway, I guess I see it differently than how the propaganda that comes out. So
Sure.
that's,
Well,
Yeah.
I'm in part asking that because we've been in the midst of this, and for me,
Yeah.
who has not, it's still so frustrating
It's-
trying to talk to representatives or
Yeah.
get that word. And it's just this sort of.
when we're there, we try to do it with the State Department there, if we can, in Erbil. We'll go there and talk to them, or and then our leaders here don't want to hear that about it. They don't. We hardly get any reception.
Other questions or comments?
Great, and I have to go on with it. Yeah.
How do you handle discouragement? Because I assume that happens to you.
It does, and I get very discouraged by these things. Yeah, that's a good question. I guess it's partly having these really special experiences, wonderful experiences with the people, feeling that love and feeling that returned. When I'm there, I spend time with children. While we were in Baghdad, I volunteered for the orphanage, or the Mother Teresa's orphanage there with handicapped children, and that really helped me get through those, the time that we were in Baghdad, because that was very discouraging. I looked for, the contacts with people, and looked for beauty around me, and that's one part of it. Then the other is, I'm not there alone. We're a team, and we regularly share and worship together. And there's times when we just all share our frustrations and encourage each other. Go to the scriptures, sing, we encourage. I remember particularly a time right before the bombing of Baghdad started, and several of us had decided to stay there. It was a very tense time. And those of us who decided to stay, as you can imagine, we often had doubts. Did I do the right thing? What's going to happen? And each one of us went through a time when we were just bottoming out and getting all of a sudden, what did I do? And the rest of the group would gather around us, our small group, our CPT group, because we were there with a larger group of Voices in the Wilderness too. But we were a little group within that. And they would just help encourage us, help us get out of that. And that happened to me. And others reached out and helped me, and I felt stronger, and I was helping others. But again, the one thing, that if I had to look to one thing, it was love and concern for what was going to happen to the people of Baghdad, the people of Iraq. That was a compelling thing that kept me going. I felt like it was that love and concern that I was given that helped me move ahead and not sink. It's hard to explain that, but that's what I felt.
maybe a hard question to conclude with, or we can
Yeah.
continue on. I was with a group of friends in Pittsburgh last weekend, deeply committed to peace and peacemaking, politically very leftist, many of them not Christians. And they were feeling a lot of despair about whether or not there can ever be any nonviolent resolution of these crises in Syria, Iraq, in the north of Nigeria. And what would you say to them?
Yeah, right.
Save an easy question for
Yeah, it's
that.
an easy question. Yeah, that's real simple.
And I don't expect any
Yeah.
comprehensive answer, because I really had none, and you know, I find your work
Yeah.
inspiring and follow the same path. But when questions like that come
It's hard.
in a gathering,
It's easier.
how might you respond?
It's easier with Christians because you can point to hope, and where does our hope come from? And knowing that we might not be able to change things, but that somehow God can work through situations. That's basically how I felt about my time there, was that we would work and then God would use that in some way. This isn't directly answering it, but every week in Athens, Ohio, we have, every Monday noon, we have a peace vigil. We're out on the streets with our peace, okay? And people will walk by and say, "What are you doing? Don't you know that you never change anything? This is ridiculous." And people say, you know, what good is this? And Art would say, or I, you know, now I say, but, you know, maybe it won't change everything, but it keeps us from being changed.
Yeah.
It keeps us on the right path, from falling into that, and in coming together and renewing that calling for peacemaking and desire for that, even if we're not being very successful, is very helpful to have that. And then the other part of that is that what happens if we don't do this? See, I mean, it's sort of reversed, but I mean, what happens if we stop speaking out? We stop going and working and being with people. We're, you know, the power, if you, I don't know, you may, some people don't like the whole idea of evil or whatever, but if you believe in the powers of evil so strong, you know, and there's people that are trying to walk toward it with a light, you know, shine a light in the darkness or whatever. What happens if people stop doing that? And, you know, so I don't think I can stop. And I don't think we should stop, because even our little voice keeps it at bay, or maybe reduces the strength, has a light, and often when we don't really know what the results are. So even if I don't know that what I do is going to really change the situation, I want to still do that work. There's something in me that compels me to do that. And part of that is seeing the result of violence, of war, is such an impact on me that I want to do whatever I can to stop that from happening again, even if it's something very small. I don't know, that may not speak to the people that are most discouraged, whatever, but that's how I deal with it.
That's good. Anything else before we conclude?
You know, just take the whole situation in America with all the African Americans being killed and imprisoned, and, you know, it's a big, big thing. It's so entrenched, this, you know, racism in our society. But if we people who are privileged, you know, I was this white American in Iraq, privileged, okay? But if it's up to us, we have more responsibility to speak out, to be allies, to speak out against injustice and say this is not in our name, this must stop. That's where something's going to happen. It's really up to us to try to walk ahead, speak out, and work against injustice. Now, that's not an easy thing to do. But if we're in a situation where we can do that, I think that's where we're called. And you might focus on that issue, another person will focus more on the climate issue. All these issues are important and are interrelated, but we're all, I believe that God calls us to really, not let the forces of evil batter against the church, And it's not a fortress, but the whole image of, the gates of hell will not prevail against it. That's prevail against the powers of good and love coming at it aggressively to deal with evil. It's reverse of what most people actually think it is. So I see the church, people of faith, called to go out there and confront and deal and try to deal with what's inside of us that supports evil too. I mean, that's part of it. So I think that's part of our calling as Christians. And if we are given leadership, you're here to be leaders, some of you are leaders, we have more responsibility to guide people that we're leading, that we're encouraging, and help them find that for themselves, that calling, a more holistic gospel, a holistic faith and service.
Thank you, Peggy.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Remember, Peggy will be speaking